honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Margaret Thatcher said, ideals are not enough to secure peace and freedom. Only military superiority and the will to use it are. Also, she said, too often the democratic, peaceful nations let slip their guard because they assumed the danger had gone, that the future would be one of peace and progress. And all too often they were wrong. For the course of history is not predictable. Great plans for peace can precede great wars. Wise words indeed, and amongst others, the aim of one of my talk is to provide evidence that she spoke with some solid classical liberal foundations when she said that. I'll give an overview on the classical liberal ideas on international relations and liberal international order. On the basis of my most recent book, published 2 years ago by the IEA, kindly asked for by Hayek, Human Nature and World Affairs, and my new article on Hayek and liberal international order, which is already published online by the Journal of International Political Theory, but it's still waiting for an assignment to an actual volume and issue. While there is abundant liberal theory in international relations as such, classical liberalism as a theory of international relations remains a rare phenomenon, while not all self-identified classical liberals know what the great thinkers thought about international politics either. And I think that's a strange lack of knowledge and awareness given the enormous importance of international affairs on the lives of individuals. So the inclusion of this session today, but also the previous talks we heard, is rare and is an additional reason for compliments to the organizers and the speakers of this conference. Before I start, I'd like to make a few preliminary remarks. First, it might seem very obvious, but it certainly isn't. But classical liberals actually had a lot to say about international politics. They were just not economists or just philosophers. They had a lot to say about international relations. And if you take the energy to actually look at it, you have to do some work, because with the exception of Mises, who wrote 2 books on international politics, the others just wrote individual paragraphs, chapters, made public remarks, speeches, or in the case of Hayek, wrote co-editorials to, especially in the Times, but also in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. So in short, to get a real good picture, you need to dig, and you need to put in the hard work. Second, international relations is about human action. Again, very obvious statement perhaps, but it's not the way a lot of people think. People think about international politics as states, as billiards ball on a snooker table, being poked around by a cue, and nothing they can do themselves. But that's not the case. It's about war. It's about people who decide about war, about peace, about negotiations, about protests. And sure enough, they often do this within a certain structure, be it a state or an international organization. So there's always some room for an agency structure debate in international relations. And in the end, the state, it might take, doesn't exist. The state is your neighbor going to an office and do her work. Or it's your president sending a tweet, and hopefully that they do this within a human-made legal framework. Third remark I'd like to make. So instead of doing the hard work to get their full views on international relations, many academics, including those of the classical liberal bent, have the rather annoying yet persistent habit of highly selective quoting when it comes to international affairs and probably other topics as well. They just pick and choose a random piece of text and present it as the first and last word on that topic of the quoted author. Yet that hardly ever represents his or her full views. A good example is Hayek on federation, where it is often claimed that it was the centerpiece of his ideas on world politics, even by reputed scholars such as Shandan Kukatas in Hayek and Modern Liberalism. But he was wrong. Now, I volunteered the term Tesco methodology for that, for this malpractice, because ideas of great thinkers cannot be treated like they're just random goods you put in your basket in the supermarket. Fourth, there's an increasing number of economists that study war and peace. Nothing wrong with that, much welcome, at least the research as such, but they do not go to the heart of the matter. So people like Coyne, like Higgs, like Ebeling, they find arguments against war and in favor of peace, often rooted in some kind of cost-benefit analysis. That's fine, but just noting that war is costly or leads to a bigger state doesn't say much about the roots of war, let alone that it provides any basis to abolish war. So therefore, it's much better to look at the comprehensive ideas of international politics of the most important classical liberals. And in this case, I did that for Hume, Smith, Hayek, and Mises, and build a classical liberal outlook on world politics from there. It's important to note that the overall goal of classical liberalism in domestic politics and international politics is identical. It's the expansion and the protection of individual liberty. So on the basis of that analysis, I distilled and worked and added a classical liberal theory of international relations, which consists of these 5 building blocks. Of course, it starts with the individual, as this is central to classical liberalism, and it's just and classical liberalism is, of course, the expression of individualism in domestic and international politics. The second building block is the group, because individuals are social creatures and groups are dominant actors in international affairs. Individual and groups get into conflict regularly. So that brings us to the classical liberal perspective on international violence, which then leads to the question of the possibility and the force of rules in international politics. And of course, there's the issue of scarcity is also abundant in international politics. So start with the individual. Needless to say that the Hayek quotes I'm going to show you on this slide and the following slide are representative for his full thought on international relations. The question about human nature is, I think, very relevant for international politics and liberalism in particular, because there's the insistent idea that a better and peaceful world is possible if people would rely on reason only. That's a very common idea. Hume, Smith, Mises, and Hayek made very clear that's naive and impossible. In the words of Smith, humans have the propensity to quarrel, fight, use violence. Or the famous quote by Hume, reason is not to be the slave of the passions. So emphasis on the power of reason as the main or sufficient explanatory factor of human behavior is erroneous. Hence, I argue that if you really want to understand the international relations, you better start reading the theory of moral sentiments or the treatise of human nature. The human drive for conflict does not concern all people all the time, but it does for some people sometimes. So no liberal argues for a state without police and judiciary because we know that some people will not abide to the law. And that's the same goes for international politics, which again is about human relations. This realistic Scottish Enlightenment view on human nature is also confirmed by modern research into human nature, for example by Wrangham, Kahneman, Rosen, Thayer, and even Pinker. A related yet different question is how to protect individual rights in the international context. In principle, that does not divert from domestic politics either. It's the natural rights to life, property, and liberty, complemented perhaps by the classical human rights as we know them now. Yet in practice, of course, that proves a bit harder because there's no overriding judge and police force in international politics, so enforcing those rights is not easy. I'll return to that later. This has not prevented the continued expansions of human rights, it was mentioned this morning before, which Hayek already noted was very problematic as it invades big state involvement in the international arena, for example, humanitarian intervention or the right to protect, which hardly ever delivers its stated objective if these are formulated beforehand at all. As said, individuals are social creatures. So what's the place of the group in classical liberal international relations? Hume, Smith, Mises, and Hayek thought that feelings of belonging to your country were a normal feature for most people, and that the sovereign nation was the most important international actor, and diplomacy was an important way to keep interstate relations. Again, this love of country was part of human nature. Smith famously distinguished the circles of sympathy, where individuals have strong feelings for those near them, family, friends, but the strength decreases as the physical distance with the others increases, with the nation as the outer unit of meaningful emotional attachment. I think that by and large still holds, even in the digital age. Also, classical liberalism is not cosmopolitan. I again refer to Smith, who noted that there is a difference between love of one's country and love of mankind. The welfare of the whole of humanity cannot be a man's task to accomplish. Men better direct their love towards their own life and the people near to them, and only that's in line with human nature, as Smith argued. Please note there's a fine line here between individualism and collectivism. It's about patriotism, but not nationalism. It's not about imperialism and colonialism, but it's about a society of states and not some supranational state either. It's also not about federation, which is not to deny that both Hayek and Mises favored the federation in many different forms, as was very fashionable in the 1930s and around the Second World War, to prevent the outbreak of that war. Yet when this failed, Mises never wrote about federation again, while Hayek continued to see it as a last resort option only when states really failed to cooperate long term. So in the 1970s and early 1980s, he favored the Federation of Jerusalem, but never joined the European Federalists, for example. Immigration is a topical debate. We had it discussed briefly this morning. And it's hard to find a shared classical liberal opinion on it. Hayek openly rejected a large influx of immigrants on the basis of cultural concerns, while Mises was more in favor in principle, but like Milton Friedman, he also saw the disadvantages of foreigners making claims to social welfare arrangements which they never contributed to, just as David Conway did in Defense of the Realm. This is a topic where many modern classical liberal economists point out the positive economic effects, very convincingly, I think, of free immigration, but they tend to overlook the social and cultural impact of immigration, which has been dominant in practical politics for decades now in many, many countries. Individuals, they quarrel and fight. And that means that violence is a permanent feature in domestic politics, but also in international politics. And I must say that nowadays, far more people find that a convincing statement than 17 years ago when I defended my PhD thesis and started to give talks on this issue. Can we abolish violent conflict and war? No. Which is not to say that we welcome war as classical liberals, or dismiss the horrors of war, or favor war. But that's something else than expecting it to abolish war. Mises was perhaps the most hopeful, but he turned he was less hopeful after the Second World War. All those forethinkers hoped to limit the impact of war, for example, by adhering to just war principles. So just war principles is that you have to have just cause for war and you have to have just behavior in war. Smith ended the theory of moral sentiments with paying homage to Grotius, for example. A way to limit, but not eradicate the occurrences of war is through the balance of power. Hume famously wrote a wonderful essay on the balance of power. Smith largely agreed. And somehow Hayek did not write about the balance of power, although he openly supported NATO, even though it's a great example of spontaneous order at the international level. It's about alliance between states that are formed for defensive purposes, at least most often, and they more or less, if these both sides of the balance each other out in military strength, a full war will hardly ever occur. It's like the invisible hand applied to international relations. But of course, as we have seen in the Cold War, small or proxy wars will sometimes break out, and the balance is never stable. So it's not a perfect anti-war device, but it helps. Hicks is of course right that there are unseen costs of war, which make states bigger. That's undeniably true, but again, it will not do anything to prevent or get rid of war. Mises and Hayek explicitly defended the free market war economy, rather topical today, rather than a state-led war economy, which made things much worse. And we'll have to see, of course, with the increased defense expenditures in the West, how that goes from now on. A last question in the context of international violence is, do we have the duty to protect the natural or human rights of others when these are violated? Or should we bring democracy to other countries through military intervention? I can only be short here, it's a long and big topic. There's never a duty to intervene, and and the right is also questionable, while in practice humanitarian interventions hardly ever work. Restraint is much better unless real genocide is going on. So what about rules to foster international order? These are needed just as they are needed in a domestic society, but also with the same classical liberal distrust. Rules and laws can foster order, but can also be a great threat to individual liberty. While international law, treaties, regimes, agreements, decisions by judges and international organizations, they overrule national law. So that requires even more restraint. The same applies to those state-like bodies we know as international organizations. Distrust towards the state applies at all levels. Hence, Mises and Hayek did not like the League of Nations at all, partly based on their own experiences in their several committees. Nor did they welcome the United Nations, its successor. Hayek saw the United Nations Declarations of Human Rights as a bad compromise between the traditional classical human rights of the West and the social demands of the Soviet bloc, leading to all kinds of unwarranted state action. So there's a need here to be to get as little international rules as possible. Functional agreements are fine about borders, about air traffic treaties, stuff like that. But we should get rid of the big international state as much as we should get rid of the big national state. So let us minimize international governmental organizations, abolish most of the United Nations, including most of its daughter organizations, abolish the World Bank, and let us reform the European Human Rights Treaties, the International Refugee Treaty, etc. NGOs are fine. Of course, they are expressions of freedom of associations, yet as long as they remain non-governmental, only paid for by voluntary contributions. So no subsidies, no tax money, and no execution of alleged or real state tasks.
Yes.
How to deal with issues of economy at the international level? Of course, the classical liberal gospel is clear: it's free trade and globalization. As Smith said, defense is of more importance than opulence. So security is first, but must not be a ground, of course, for protectionism. So the current debate about strategic autonomy, probably not by coincidence started by France, is an example in case. Very Smithian is one aspect, but protectionism is certainly also part of it. So we have to be very careful here. However, and this is my hobby horse, so I won't talk too much about it, Smith never predicted that free trade would foster peace. War is multi-causal, and trade can never eradicate all these causes, let alone change the fundamental traits of human nature. So let's keep the fairy tale where it is. Mises and Hayek, under the influence of Lord Bauer, of course, were very much opposed to development aid. It was a waste of money. Poor countries just needed solid and good policies. I trust most of you are not IR theorists, not particularly interested in the finer details of the many liberal and other theories that have been introduced by IR scholars in the past century or so. Still, it might be useful to say a few words of the differences between the classical liberal IR theory and other liberalisms you will encounter should you encounter a IR theory textbook. But perhaps you will run from it. But still, you may. And you may also think about the difference between realism and classical liberalism. Because a lot of people say to me, yeah, that's all fine, your classical liberal IR theory, but it's just another form of realism. Well, it's not. Sometimes, but the main difference with the realists is, for example, and Kissinger was just on the screen, for realists, of course, individual freedom is not a concern, let alone a central concern. They only look at reasons of state and security issues. And they also think that great powers should determine what happens in the world and believe international relations is about anarchy. They largely deny the possibility of the occurrence of a society of states, as classical liberals think, very much like English school theorists Martin White and Hadley Bull, or the Canadian thinker Robert Jackson. The main differences with other liberal theories are, these are all almost with no exception based on social liberal thought. They think that humans are rational enough to create a better and a peaceful world. And that should be achieved on the basis of international collaboration, preferably between liberal democratic states, aided by international law and international organizations. In short, these are basically constructivist theories in the Hayekian sense, staining the reputation of liberal thought with starry-eyed fantasies, just as their domestic counterparts. That brings me to my last slide, about the very topical debate about the alleged or real demise of the so-called liberal international order, or LIO. I had a blog post at the IEA website a few weeks ago arguing that if you assume that the liberal international order is indeed going down the drain, that's not as bad as it sounds. Because if you read the work of John Eikenberry, the main LIO theorist, that order is to a large extent social liberal as well. The difference is with the other liberals is that Eikenberry acknowledges the Westphalian foundations of the current international order, which developed over time after the First World War and Woodrow Wilson's 14 points plan. So Eikenberry and Hayek agree on the importance of the nation state as the prime actor in world politics, the role of the balance of power, the need for security cooperation due to the inevitability of international conflict and war. Yet all other elements of his theory are drenched in social justice and constructivism, which would be rejected by Hayek and other classical liberals. In the classical liberal view, foreign policy should be about restraint, while rejecting isolationism. It should be about free trade and globalization, yet without the erroneous idea that trade promotes peace. It should be about deconstructing big state internationalism, big international law, and increasing power to international courts and organizations. And most importantly, fostering individual liberty should be at the core of foreign affairs.